The Napoleonic Wars were a series of major conflicts that took place in Europe and beyond between the years 1803 and 1815. These wars were centered around one man named Napoleon Bonaparte, a French military leader who rose from modest beginnings to become the ruler of France and one of the most powerful figures in world history. His ambition, intelligence, and military skill changed the course of Europe and affected millions of lives. To understand how the Napoleonic Wars began, it is important to look at the events that happened before Napoleon came to power. In 1789, the French Revolution began. At that time, France was ruled by a king named Louis XVI. French society was deeply unequal. The rich nobles and clergy had privileges, while ordinary people faced high taxes, poverty, and food shortages. Many people were angry and frustrated. They wanted change, fairness, and a voice in government. The revolution turned violent. The king was overthrown and later executed in 1793. France became a republic, meaning it no longer had a king. However, the revolution created chaos and instability. Different political groups fought each other for control. Violence spread throughout the country. At the same time, other European monarchies such as Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia feared that revolutionary ideas might spread to their own countries. They formed alliances and went to war against revolutionary France. France needed strong military leaders to defend itself. One of these leaders was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, which had recently become part of France. His family was not wealthy, but they supported his education. Napoleon attended military school in mainland France and became an officer in the French army. He was known for his intelligence, discipline, and determination. During the early Revolutionary Wars, Napoleon showed great talent as a commander. In 1796, he was given command of the French army in Italy. At that time, France was fighting Austria and its allies. Napoleon led his troops through difficult terrain and defeated larger enemy forces using speed, careful planning, and surprise attacks. His victories made him famous in France. People began to see him as a hero who could bring stability and strength. In 1798, Napoleon led an expedition to Egypt. His goal was to weaken Britain by threatening its trade routes to India. Although he won some battles on land, the British Navy defeated the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. This left Napoleon and his army stranded in Egypt. Eventually, Napoleon returned to France, leaving his army behind. When Napoleon returned to France in 1799, the government was weak and unpopular. Many people feared that France might collapse into further chaos. Napoleon saw an opportunity. In November 1799, he took part in a political takeover known as a coup. He overthrew the existing government and established a new system with himself as the main leader. This marked the beginning of his rise to absolute power. Over the next few years, Napoleon strengthened his control. He introduced reforms that improved administration, law, education, and the economy. One of his most important achievements was the creation of the Napoleonic Code, a set of laws that guaranteed equality before the law for all male citizens, protected property rights, and ended many old feudal privileges. This legal system influenced many countries around the world. In 1804, Napoleon took another dramatic step. He crowned himself Emperor of the French. This meant that France was no longer a republic, but an empire ruled by Napoleon. Although he claimed to protect the ideals of the revolution, he now held more power than any king before him. Other European nations were alarmed by Napoleon's growing power. Britain, which had been fighting France for years, remained his strongest enemy. Britain was a powerful naval nation with a strong economy and global trade networks. It feared that Napoleon wanted to dominate Europe and threaten British independence. Austria, Russia, and other nations joined Britain to form alliances against France. These alliances were known as coalitions. Their goal was to defeat Napoleon and restore balance in Europe. Napoleon understood that he needed to defeat his enemies quickly before they could fully organize. He built one of the most effective armies in history. His soldiers were loyal and motivated. Many believed they were defending the achievements of the revolution. Napoleon organized his army into independent units called corps. Each corps could move and fight on its own, but also support others when needed. This gave his army speed and flexibility. In 1805, a major conflict known as the War of the Third Coalition began. Britain, Austria, and Russia joined forces against Napoleon. Napoleon planned to invade Britain, but he needed control of the sea. In October 1805, the British Navy, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, defeated the French and Spanish fleets at the Battle of Trafalgar. This battle took place off the coast of Spain. It was a decisive British victory. It ensured that Britain would remain dominant at sea and prevented Napoleon from invading the British Isles. However, Napoleon was still extremely powerful on land. In December 1805, he faced the combined armies of Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz, near the town of Austerlitz in modern-day Czech Republic. This battle became one of his greatest victories. Napoleon carefully positioned his troops and tricked the enemy into attacking where he was strongest. His forces defeated the larger Allied army. Austria was forced to make peace, and the coalition collapsed. This victory strengthened Napoleon's control over Europe. He reorganized territories and created new kingdoms ruled by his allies and family members. He placed his brother Joseph on the throne of Naples and later Spain. He placed his brother Louis on the throne of Holland. In this way, Napoleon extended his influence far beyond France. Napoleon also dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for nearly 1,000 years. In its place, he created a new alliance of German states called the Confederation of the Rhine. This weakened Austria and increased French influence in Central Europe. Despite these victories, Napoleon still faced opposition. Britain remained undefeated and continued to resist him. Because he could not defeat Britain at sea, Napoleon tried a different strategy. He attempted to weaken Britain economically. He introduced a system known as the Continental System. This policy aimed to block British goods from being traded in European ports under French control. Napoleon hoped this would damage Britain's economy and force it to surrender. However, enforcing this system proved difficult. Smuggling became common. Many European countries depended on trade with Britain and suffered economically under Napoleon's restrictions. This created resentment against French rule. Meanwhile, Prussia, another powerful European state, became concerned about Napoleon's growing influence. In 1806, Prussia joined the war against France. Napoleon responded quickly. His army defeated Prussian forces at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt in October 1806. These victories allowed Napoleon to occupy Berlin, the Prussian capital. Napoleon then turned east to face Russia. In 1807, French and Russian forces fought at the Battle of Friedland. Napoleon achieved another victory. This forced the Russian Tsar Alexander I to negotiate peace. The two leaders met and signed the Treaty of Tilsit. This agreement made Russia an ally of France, at least temporarily. At this point, Napoleon had reached the height of his power. France dominated much of Europe. Only Britain remained fully independent and openly opposed to him. Napoleon appeared unstoppable. But beneath this surface of success, problems were beginning to grow. His empire was large and difficult to control. Many conquered people resented French rule. National pride and resistance movements began to emerge. His efforts to control Europe completely would soon lead to new conflicts that would test his power and change his fate forever. By the year 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. His armies had defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia in a series of decisive battles. Much of Central Europe was now under French control or ruled by leaders loyal to him. Only Britain remained fully independent and actively opposed to his rule. Unable to defeat Britain directly at sea, Napoleon focused on weakening it economically through his Continental System. The Continental System was designed to block British goods from entering European markets. Napoleon believed that Britain depended heavily on trade and that cutting off its access to European ports would damage its economy and force it to make peace. He ordered all countries under his control or influence to stop trading with Britain. This included major ports in Germany, Italy, Spain, and elsewhere. However, this system created serious problems. Many European countries relied on British goods, such as textiles, tools, and manufactured products. Without these goods, shortages and economic hardship began to spread. Merchants lost income, and ordinary people faced rising prices. Smuggling became widespread as traders secretly continued to buy and sell British goods despite the ban. One of the countries most affected by this system was Portugal. Portugal had long been an ally of Britain and depended on British trade. When Portugal refused to fully comply with the continental system, Napoleon decided to act. In 1807, he sent French troops into Portugal to enforce his orders. To reach Portugal, French troops had to pass through Spain. At that time, Spain was ruled by a weak king named Charles IV. Napoleon saw an opportunity to increase his control. He pressured the Spanish royal family to give up their throne and replace them with his own brother Joseph Bonaparte in 1808. Napoleon believed this would secure French influence in Spain. However, the Spanish people strongly resisted French rule. They did not accept Joseph Bonaparte as their king. In May 1808, a popular uprising broke out in Madrid. Spanish citizens attacked French soldiers. The French army responded with harsh force, executing many civilians. This event shocked the population and sparked widespread resistance across Spain. This conflict became known as the Peninsular War. It lasted from 1808 to 1814 and became one of Napoleon's most difficult and costly struggles. Spanish fighters used guerrilla warfare, which involved small groups carrying out surprise attacks and then disappearing. These fighters knew the land well and could strike quickly before French forces could respond. Britain saw this as an opportunity to weaken Napoleon. British troops, led by General Arthur Wellesley, who later became known as the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal to support Spanish and Portuguese resistance. Together, they fought against French forces. The fighting was slow and difficult. French troops faced constant attacks, supply problems, and growing exhaustion. The Peninsular War forced Napoleon to keep large numbers of soldiers tied down in Spain and Portugal. These were soldiers he could not use elsewhere. This weakened his overall military strength. Meanwhile, Napoleon's relationship with Russia began to deteriorate. Although Tsar Alexander I had agreed to support Napoleon after the Treaty of Tilsit, tensions grew over time. Russia suffered economically under the continental system. Its economy depended on exporting goods such as grain, timber, and raw materials. The trade restrictions caused serious financial losses. By 1810, Russia began ignoring parts of the continental system and resumed trade with Britain. Napoleon saw this as a betrayal. He believed that Russia was challenging his authority and threatening his empire. Both sides began preparing for war. Napoleon decided to invade Russia. This would become one of the most important and disastrous decisions of his career. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled a massive army known as the Grand Army. It included more than 600,000 soldiers from France and allied nations such as Poland, Germany, and Italy. It was the largest army Europe had ever seen. Napoleon expected a quick victory. He believed he could defeat Russian forces in a decisive battle and force Tsar Alexander to negotiate peace. However, the Russian army used a different strategy. Instead of fighting immediately, they retreated deeper into their own territory. As they retreated, they destroyed crops, burned villages, and removed supplies. This strategy was known as scorched earth. It prevented Napoleon's army from finding food and shelter. As the French army moved deeper into Russia, supply lines became stretched and difficult to maintain. Soldiers suffered from hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. Horses died from lack of food. Wagons broke down on rough roads. Disease began to spread. In September 1812, Napoleon's army reached the city of Moscow after fighting a major battle at Borodino. The Battle of Borodino was one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Although Napoleon technically won the battle, the Russian army was not destroyed. It retreated again. Napoleon entered Moscow expecting the Russians to surrender. Instead, he found the city nearly empty. Soon fires broke out across Moscow. Much of the city burned. The fires destroyed supplies that Napoleon needed. Tsar Alexander refused to negotiate. Napoleon waited in Moscow for several weeks hoping for peace, but it never came. Meanwhile, winter was approaching. Russian winters were extremely cold. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Napoleon realized he had to retreat. In October 1812, the French army began its retreat from Moscow. This retreat became one of the greatest disasters in military history. Soldiers faced freezing temperatures, hunger, disease, and constant attacks from Russian forces. Many froze to death. Others died from starvation or exhaustion. The once massive Grand Army was destroyed during the retreat. By the time Napoleon reached safety, only a small fraction of his original army remained. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had died. This disaster weakened Napoleon severely. His enemies saw an opportunity. Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain formed a new alliance against him. This alliance became known as the Sixth Coalition. They prepared to challenge Napoleon and push French forces out of Europe. For the first time in many years, Napoleon was no longer unstoppable. His empire began to crack under pressure. The losses in Russia and ongoing fighting in Spain drained his strength. His enemies were growing stronger and more determined. The stage was now set for the final phase of the Napoleonic Wars, where the balance of power would shift and Napoleon's future would be decided. After the disaster in Russia in 1812, Europe understood that Napoleon was no longer invincible. The destruction of the Grand Army had shaken the foundation of his empire. Across the continent, nations that had once feared him began to rise against him. In early 1813, Prussia, which had been defeated years earlier, declared war on France. Russia continued advancing westward, determined to push French forces out of Eastern Europe. Britain supported these efforts with money, weapons, and supplies. Austria at first hesitated, but eventually joined the growing alliance against Napoleon. This new alliance became known as the Sixth Coalition. Napoleon moved quickly to rebuild his army. Despite losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers in Russia, France still had a large population. Young men were called up to serve. Many were inexperienced and very young, some barely adults. Napoleon trained them rapidly and prepared for another campaign in Germany. In the spring of 1813, Napoleon won several battles in Saxony, including the battles of Lutzen and Botzen. These victories showed that he still possessed military skill and determination. However, his new army lacked the experienced cavalry and veterans he had lost in Russia. His forces were not as strong as before. During the summer of 1813, a temporary ceasefire allowed both sides to reorganize. Austria joined the coalition during this pause, tipping the balance further against Napoleon. The coalition leaders agreed on a strategy to avoid direct confrontation with Napoleon himself whenever possible. Instead, they aimed to defeat his marshals and isolate him. In October 1813, the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars took place near the city of Leipzig in present-day Germany. This battle became known as the Battle of Leipzig or the Battle of the Nations. More than 600,000 soldiers from multiple countries participated. It lasted 4 days. Napoleon's forces fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered. Coalition troops from Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden attacked from several directions. After days of intense fighting, Napoleon was forced to retreat. During the withdrawal, a bridge was destroyed too early, leaving thousands of French soldiers trapped and captured. The defeat at Leipzig marked a major turning point. It ended French dominance in Germany. Following Leipzig, coalition forces advanced westward toward France itself. Meanwhile, in Spain, British and Spanish troops under the Duke of Wellington continued pushing French forces out of the Iberian Peninsula. By 1814, French control in Spain had collapsed. In early 1814, coalition armies crossed into France. For the first time in many years, war reached French soil. Napoleon fought a series of defensive battles in northeastern France. He showed flashes of his old brilliance, winning several small victories against separate enemy forces. However, he was overwhelmed by the sheer number of coalition troops. In March 1814, coalition forces entered Paris. The French government lost confidence in Napoleon. Many of his own officials believed the war could not continue. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate, meaning he gave up his throne as emperor. The coalition powers decided not to execute him or imprison him in a distant prison. Instead, they exiled him to the island of Elba, a small island in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Italy. Napoleon was allowed to rule Elba as its leader, though the island was small and had a population of only about 12,000 people. Meanwhile, in France, the Bourbon monarchy was restored. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed King Louis XVI, became king. Many hoped that peace would finally return to Europe after years of constant war. At the same time, leaders from across Europe gathered in Vienna, Austria, for a major diplomatic meeting known as the Congress of Vienna. This Congress began in late 1814. Its goal was to reorganize Europe after the defeat of Napoleon and restore balance of power. Leaders such as Prince Metternich of Austria, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and representatives from Britain and Prussia discussed how to redraw borders and prevent future revolutions. They aimed to strengthen traditional monarchies and create a stable system that would prevent any one nation from dominating Europe as France had done. Territories were rearranged. The Netherlands was strengthened. Prussia gained land in western Germany. Austria regained influence in Italy. The goal was long-term stability. However, peace would not last immediately. In February 1815, Napoleon escaped from the island of Elba. He sailed back to France with a small group of loyal followers. As he marched toward Paris, troops were sent to arrest him. Instead of fighting him, many soldiers joined him. Napoleon addressed them directly and reminded them of past victories. His presence inspired loyalty. King Louis XVIII fled France. Napoleon returned to power in what became known as the 100 Days. European leaders were shocked and alarmed. They quickly formed another alliance, known as the Seventh Coalition, determined to defeat him once and for all. Napoleon knew he had little time. He decided to strike quickly before coalition forces could fully unite. In June 1815, he led his army into present-day Belgium, where British and Prussian forces were gathering. On June 18, 1815, the final and decisive battle took place near the village of Waterloo. Napoleon faced British forces led by the Duke of Wellington and Prussian forces led by Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The battle lasted the entire day. French forces launched repeated attacks against British defensive positions. Heavy rain from the night before had turned the ground muddy, slowing movement and artillery. Fighting was intense and exhausting. Late in the afternoon, Prussian reinforcements arrived, strengthening the Allied position. Napoleon's army was unable to break through. As evening approached, coalition forces counterattacked. The French lines collapsed. Napoleon suffered a decisive defeat. After Waterloo, Napoleon returned to Paris but found little support. He abdicated for a second time. This time the Allies did not take chances. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, far from Europe. There he would remain until his death in 1821. With the defeat at Waterloo, the Napoleonic Wars came to an end. But the consequences of these long years of conflict would shape Europe for generations to come. After the defeat at Waterloo in June 1815, the long period of conflict known as the Napoleonic Wars finally came to an end. For more than 20 years, Europe had been shaped by revolution, ambition, and nearly constant warfare. Entire generations had grown up during conflict. Millions of soldiers and civilians had experienced loss, displacement, hunger, and uncertainty. Now the continent faced the difficult task of rebuilding stability. Napoleon Bonaparte was sent far away to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean. Unlike Elba, this island was extremely remote, thousands of kilometers from Europe and surrounded by vast waters. The British government chose it carefully to prevent another escape. Napoleon lived there under supervision. He spent his final years reflecting on his life, writing about his campaigns, and defending his legacy. He died in 1821 at the age of 51. The official cause was stomach illness, though debate about his health has continued for many years. With Napoleon gone, European leaders focused on preventing another period of domination by a single powerful ruler. The Congress of Vienna, which had begun before Waterloo, now finalized its decisions. The leaders aimed to create what they called a balance of power. This meant no single country should become strong enough to control the continent as France had under Napoleon. France itself was not destroyed or divided. Instead, it was reduced to its earlier borders and required to pay financial compensation. The Allies understood that humiliating France too severely might create future instability. Their goal was long-term peace rather than revenge. Several important changes reshaped Europe. The German states were reorganized into a loose association called the German Confederation under Austrian influence. Italy remained divided into several states, many under Austrian control. The Kingdom of the Netherlands was strengthened to act as a buffer against future French expansion. Prussia gained territory in Western Germany, which later helped it become a major power. Russia gained influence in Poland. Britain, which had maintained naval superiority throughout the wars, expanded its global empire and strengthened its position as a leading world power. The Congress of Vienna also restored many traditional monarchies that had been removed during the Revolutionary period. Kings and royal families returned to their thrones in Spain, Naples, and other regions. Conservative leaders, such as Prince Metternich of Austria, believed that strong monarchies and cooperation between great powers would prevent revolution and war. To maintain stability, the major powers formed a system of cooperation, sometimes called the Concert of Europe. Through regular meetings and communication, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and later France aimed to resolve disputes peacefully. For several decades after 1815, Europe avoided large-scale continental war. This period of relative peace lasted until the outbreak of the Crimean War in 1853. However, the Napoleonic Wars had lasting effects that could not simply be reversed. One of the most powerful ideas spread during the wars was nationalism. As French armies had moved across Europe, they had often introduced new laws, ended feudal privileges, and reorganized territories. At the same time, many people developed a stronger sense of national identity in opposition to French rule. Germans, Italians, and others began to think of themselves as united peoples rather than separate states. In the decades that followed, these nationalist movements would lead to the unification of Germany and Italy. The wars also accelerated social and political change. The Napoleonic Code continued to influence legal systems in many countries. Ideas about equality before the law, merit-based advancement, and civil rights remained powerful even after monarchies were restored. In some places, rulers attempted to limit political freedoms, but demands for constitutional government continued to grow. Economically, the wars have been expensive and destructive. Agriculture, trade, and industry have been disrupted. Many regions needed years to recover. At the same time, Britain benefited from its strong navy and expanding trade networks. The British Industrial Revolution advanced rapidly during and after the wars, increasing production of textiles, iron, and machinery. This economic strength helped Britain maintain global influence throughout the 19th century. For ordinary people, the Napoleonic Wars meant hardship. Soldiers marched across vast distances in difficult conditions. Many died from wounds, disease, or exposure. Families waited for news that often never came. Towns were occupied by foreign armies. Taxes increased to support military campaigns. Farmers saw crops taken for supplies. Civilians in Spain, Russia, Germany, and elsewhere experienced violence and destruction. Yet the wars also created opportunities for social mobility. In Napoleon's army, men could rise in rank based on ability rather than noble birth. This idea of merit became influential beyond France. Military service allowed some individuals from humble backgrounds to gain education and leadership experience. When historians look back at the Napoleonic Wars, they see both the ambition of one extraordinary individual and the broader forces of revolution and change. Napoleon was a brilliant military strategist who reshaped Europe through speed, organization, and bold decision-making. At the same time, his desire for control and expansion led to prolonged conflict that exhausted nations. The wars redrew the political map of Europe. They strengthened Britain as a global empire. They planted seeds of nationalism that would shape the 19th century. They demonstrated the power of mass conscription, modern administration, and coordinated strategy. Warfare became larger in scale and more organized than in previous centuries. By the time peace settled over Europe after 1815, the continent was not the same as it had been before the French Revolution. Old structures had been challenged. New ideas about law, citizenship, and national identity had spread widely. Although monarchies returned, the memory of revolution and reform could not be erased. The Napoleonic Wars, therefore, stand as a bridge between the old world of kings and empires and the modern world of nations and political movements. They remind us how quickly power can rise and fall, and how deeply the decisions of leaders can affect millions of lives. In the quiet years that followed, Europe rebuilt cities, restored trade, and tried to heal from decades of war. But the legacy of Napoleon and the conflicts that bore his name continued to shape history long after the cannons fell silent.